Hello and welcome to another episode of Essex by the Sea. I'm Owen Ward, exploring the Essex coast, finding out about the amazing and interesting stories it has to offer. Don't forget you can follow us on social media, Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. Just search for Essex by the Sea and encourage your friends to like and follow as well. This episode we're focusing on Mersea Island. It's a project that's been taking place that's looked at coastal erosion on the island. Danielle Newman and Northall are community archaeologists and join me now.
Hello.
Hello.
Thanks very much for joining me. Danielle, let's start with you, if I may. What's the project about then that you've been working on?
So the project is called Changing Minds, Changing Coasts, and it's a small project that was funded by the Natural Environment Research Council out of a larger project. So Lawrence and I both work for CITiZAN, which is the Coastal and Intertidal Zone Archaeological Network. And we are based in 5 different discovery programs around England. I'm based on Mersea Island, and Lawrence is based in Kent. And really what our project is about is using citizen science and people who do lots of coastal walking to help us record intertidal archaeology and archaeology that is essentially eroding out of the beaches and the coasts of England. Changing Minds, Changing Coasts project is built on that, and it's really looking at the coastal changes that have happened on Mersea Island over the last 100 years, using a combination of our information that we have from the CITiZAN project, so lots and lots of wonderful data about how the coastline has changed, oral histories, archive material, and maps.
And I guess when you bring all of this together, it then does build up a much bigger picture, and I don't mean picture in necessarily in the literal sense, of how our coasts are changing. And of course, on the Essex coast, it has changed hugely with so much coastline that we have.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. And what we found when we started looking at all the different indicators and all the different changes that had happened, the different data sets, we were really able to see how they complemented each other and how really on their own, neither of them presented the full picture. It was only when we got the 3 of them together that we were able to start digging into how these changes happened and why they'd happened.
Lawrence, you focus very much on the oral history for this project then. So what are some of the stories that people have told you about the coast on Mersea?
Yeah, so by talking to local people, I was able to learn a lot about personal memories of how the foreshore has changed in terms of its topography. For example, the salt marsh might have receded, and how those changes have been in some ways caused also by changes in wildlife and fauna and flora. So, for example, seagrasses that were once prolific in the 1920s, they've slowly kind of died out in a big way. And these plants would have the property of binding the mud with their roots and also effectively giving rise to ecological systems of mollusks and things like that would process the mud and reform it in a way that made it more resilient to the effects of erosion. So those kind of memories of how the biodiversity has changed, as well as the foreshore itself, have been really useful for tracking the kind of loss of the foreshore. But also memories about archaeological features can sometimes be useful, because some archaeological features, for instance, can give us an idea about how the coast has changed in the past. As an example, if you see a sea wall that is far out now into the intertidal zone, you can say with a certain amount of certainty that that's where there was a high tide mark at the time that the wall was built. So things like that can be useful if those remains are now lost, but people remember where they were. We can then track changes based on things like that. Some archaeological features will provide indicators in that they would have once been exposed at low tide, for instance, and they no longer are. So people might remember that a wreck, for instance, was exposed in the 1970s but hasn't been exposed since then, which can say a lot about the nature of sea level rise and how that has affected the accessibility of certain sites.
I mean, the people of Mersea Island will have, I'm sure, loads of stories that they've probably spent hours reciting and telling you, which must have all been fascinating. But I suppose if you live somewhere and there's just very small incremental changes, perhaps you don't notice it very much. But as you say, if there is a seawall that's now out to sea quite a way, you're going to notice it more. In a previous episode, got a tour of the Naze Tower at Walton on the Naze, where there again is coastal erosion happening there, and quite obvious there's some World War II pillboxes that were once standing on top of the cliffs and not on the cliff edges that are now out in the sea. Is there a similar situation in Mersea?
There's a very similar situation in East Mersea, where there were Second World War batteries that were on top of what weren't even cliffs when they were installed there, but kind of sloping areas down towards the foreshore. But as sea levels rose and erosion took hold, they became cliffs and eventually became so unstable that I think in the late 80s they had to bulldoze them off onto the foreshore to stop them being a hazard to the public. So yeah, we have exactly the same thing essentially.
And Danielle, how has the archival material that I'm sure you've spent hours combing through helped to build this picture up for the project, and how our coast has changed?
Well, I think, as I said, the beautiful thing about having the images is that we were really able to use them in combination with the oral histories. And part of this project it was all done over COVID. So we had very limited opportunities to go to Mersea Island while this was going on. And we really wanted to involve the community as much as possible. So what we did actually was, as we went through these images, and a lot of them came from the incredible archives at Mersea Island Museum, which are just absolutely top notch. As we went through these images, and we found ones that we were interested in, but we couldn't quite pinpoint where they were, when they were, and sort of what was going on in the images, we would send them to local community members, and we actually devised a quiz to do this, which was quite wonderful. And so through that, we began to get more oral histories that were very much about the areas we were interested in. So effectively, the images acted as an aide-memoire to the people who were talking about the changes that had happened on Mersea Island. And they also provided a really good opportunity for us to engage people in the community to go out and take replica photos for us, because we couldn't go out there and we wanted very much to show the scale of change. We wanted contemporary photos. What we did on the maps is we made viewshed images. So that would we could show our volunteers exactly where we thought the images were taken from, and they could go out and replicate them for us. So through that, really, the images were able to help bring things together, help bring memories together, and also show the rate of change that's happened on the island.
And through those images, I've seen some of them. Whoever it is that's been taking the photos, credit to them, because to be able to replicate a photo and pinpoint exactly where the original one was taken is quite an art in itself. But then to replicate it and see how much has changed as well through those pictures, I guess, as you say, gives you such an insight, particularly if you can't visit yourself.
They're hugely powerful images, and it was, I think everybody involved was quite surprised when we were going back through the archival images, and we were working with the volunteers, and they say, "Oh, that's Cudmore Grove, which is one of our sites. That's Monkey Beach, another one of our sites." We were in sometimes we were very surprised, because in 100 years they've changed so much that they sometimes aren't very recognizable.
I was going to say, yeah, I guess actually some images, people today from, look at an image back then would struggle to identify exactly where it was. But then in some cases there are landmarks or certain points in the photo which then give it away as to its location.
Yeah, I think also oral histories were important in that. Local knowledge was really critical to dating and locating images, because you needed to be someone who had known that a fence was put up in a certain place, for instance, at a certain time, to know that must be the date that it was from or before, for instance. So yeah, that was a big part of it, local knowledge.
That's exactly it. This project really couldn't have happened if we hadn't had the support of the people of Mersea Island, and we hadn't had such an incredible response to the questions that we asked, the images that we put put out there, because there's so much knowledge that these people have, and a lot of people on Mersea Island have really, the sea is their life, and they've been walking these beaches for their entire lives. So they've noticed all of these changes. They understand these changes, and it's a small enough place that they can remember all of them as well.
Just before we continue, though, I would just mention that it wasn't just myself and Danielle that were working on the project. We also had Oliver Hutchinson, who can't be here today. So just to mention that he was also instrumental in the project, and he took care of the mapping side of things.
Good shout out to Oliver there, because actually I'm guessing old maps as well then would have helped to paint the picture of how our coastline has changed, because we're very fortunate here in the UK. We've got some very incredibly detailed maps and an archive of those. Has Oliver spent many hours poring over those to see the differences?
Yeah, exactly that. And I think an important part of it was looking at old tidelines on the maps, for instance. And for example, the size of certain islands is substantially diminished along the coast of Mersea, like Cobmarsh Island, which in 1923 was double the size it is now when they got the deed. So yeah, things like that, you can see them on maps.
And I think certainly when it came time to presenting this, so we were able to make in particular, Lawrence was able to make an absolutely fantastic story map of the project. And the maps themselves became the linchpin that the oral histories and the archive images could be put onto. So they really helped contextualize all of the stories and all the images that we had, and turned into something incredibly beautiful and a really lovely way of re-examining how we as archaeologists look at change that's happened on an island.
With all this data then and the stories that you've been told, some people might then say, yes, our coasts change, that's nature. Others may say, oh, it's an effect of climate change. Is it nature happening? Is it climate change, or is it actually us humans doing other things that then influence what's happening along our coastline?
I think we've, with a certain amount of assuredness, seen that it's a combination of all those things, really, and that they're quite interlinked in many ways. Climate change certainly plays a role, and that is very clear over the last 100 years through sea level rise. But there are also the effects of certain human activities, like the intensification of farming after the Second World War, or the use of certain chemicals on boats in the 1970s to the early 80s. And we kind of see that through people's stories, that they actually saw the effects of those things. And for instance, when the chemicals that were toxic to the environment were banned, they observed a recovery. So yeah, it's a combination of all these things, but the natural processes also play a part and go alongside it, because once you lose one aspect of the ecosystem, the knock-on effects are very great. So it's a combination of all those things, I think, and they're very interlinked.
Now you've done the bulk of the project, I presume, and have all this data. What's that now going to form and influence going forward?
Well, we've been doing lots of talking about how we can move this methodology on. So really, what the Natural Environment Research Council funded us to do was to develop a way of engaging with the public on something to do with science during COVID-19. And what we ended up developing is this methodology that in some ways kind of transcends that. It's something that can be applied by any organization who's interested in studying coastal change around the world, as long as they can find their own indicators that work with the community that they are working with. So we are hoping to move this on. We're looking at maybe developing something to take on the Greater Thames Estuary, so to study change along the Thames, or potentially to look at different types of sites around the UK.
Also, I would just say that on a more local level, I think we would like the results of this project to be able to inform future decisions and future attitudes towards Mersea's coastline. We've seen that in the past, certain measures that have been taken by authorities to try and prevent coastal erosion have actually made it worse. And we're also hoping that this might give some kind of evidence base to the practices that could see the future more positive for the coast of Mersea.
I understand that the project has been shortlisted for an award. Is this correct?
This is indeed correct. So we have just been shortlisted for a Council for British Archaeology Innovation Award, which will be presented start of December, I believe.
Oh, fantastic. Well, we'll keep our fingers crossed for that. I would certainly encourage your next project to stick with the Essex coast, of course. There's so much of it and such diverse coastline to look at. You could be there for years, I'm sure. But Danielle and Lawrence, time has beaten us. Thank you ever so much for joining me here on Essex by the Sea.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Don't forget, you can subscribe to Essex by the Sea on your favourite podcast app. You can also play it on a smart speaker as well. Just ask it to play Essex by the Sea podcast. Until next time, thanks very much for listening.